What if the key to humanity's future lies not in our past, but in the unknown reaches of time itself? As the boundaries between now and forever blur, one man must decide: will he change history or let time take its own course? For as long as Ethan could remember, the night sky had always been a source of wonder. It was something he would often gaze at for hours, lost in the vastness of the universe, thinking about the countless stars and the endless expanse of space. But lately, something had shifted. There were nights when the stars felt different, as if they were hiding something important. It started with small, barely noticeable flickers, lights in the sky that didn't belong. At first, he thought they were satellites, or maybe distant aircraft, but there was something too deliberate about their movement, a precision that felt unnerving. Ethan had spent years studying UFOs, poring over countless reports and sightings. His interest in time travel wasn't far behind. He'd always been fascinated by the idea of time as a construct, something bendable, moldable, not fixed as science told him it was. He devoured every article, every theory, hoping to stumble upon the breakthrough that would tie the two obsessions together. But even he, with all his knowledge, couldn't have predicted what would come next. One evening, while seated at his cluttered desk filled with maps, charts, and books, something caught his eye. A pattern. The flickering lights he had been noticing for weeks weren't just random. They formed a trajectory. It was subtle, but undeniable. They were moving in a manner that defied the conventional behavior of anything he had ever read about. These lights didn't belong in the skies above the small town where he lived, and they didn't follow any established flight patterns. There was something intentional about them, something methodical. As the days passed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these phenomena than simple UFO sightings. What if they weren't extraterrestrial visitors at all? What if these weren't ships from distant planets, but rather time travelers, humans from the future, visiting us in secret? It wasn't an entirely new thought. After all, he'd come across the theory before, dismissed it, then gone back to his usual research. But now, in light of what he was seeing in the sky, the idea took root. The lights he saw were no longer just a curiosity. They were a puzzle. The thought was ludicrous, but the evidence was stacking up. The precise movements, the way they seemed to appear and disappear at will, everything about them screamed a level of technology that humans didn't possess, at least not in the present day. Could it be that the future was here, not to observe us, but to monitor, to watch the way humanity's story unfolded, all while staying hidden in plain sight? That night, as he lay in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, Ethan felt an odd sense of calm mixed with anticipation. The questions he had been chasing for years suddenly felt more urgent. Something was happening, something big, and he was determined to find out what. Ethan's obsession with the unexplained had led him down countless rabbit holes over the years, but it wasn't until he stumbled upon an obscure document in a dusty corner of a library archive that he felt something shift. The file was old, brittle, and tucked away in a stack of forgotten government papers. It was the kind of thing that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not to Ethan. He had a knack for finding hidden gems, details that others overlooked, and this one seemed too important to ignore. The document, dated back to the early 1960s, was labeled with a code that Ethan didn't recognize, something far too official for a simple research paper. As he flipped through its yellowed pages, a series of names and military references jumped out at him. But it was a brief mention of something far stranger that caught his attention: a failed experiment marked only as Project Kronos, with a vague description of time manipulation research. No details, no specifics, just the implication that the project had been more than just theoretical. Ethan's heart raced. Time travel was something he had always considered speculative, a fantasy built from the mind of science fiction writers. But this document suggested that someone, some group, had actually tried to tamper with the very fabric of time itself. He couldn't help but wonder, had these experiments gone further than the document suggested? Could they have succeeded? And if so, where were the results? In the days that followed, Ethan dove deeper into the archives. He scoured old government records, cross-referencing names and dates, piecing together bits of information from unrelated sources. It didn't take long before he began to notice a disturbing pattern. There were several UFO sightings in the decades following the early 1960s, clustered around areas that, according to this newly uncovered document, had been active with classified military experiments. The locations matched, and the timeframes aligned with a frequency of UFO reports that couldn't be explained away by natural phenomena. As he connected the dots, the implications hit him like a freight train. The UFOs weren't just alien craft, as so many had assumed. They were something far more likely humans from the future. The connection was so absurd that at first, he dismissed it as fanciful thinking. But the more he examined the evidence, the clearer it became. The mysterious nature of the UFOs, their erratic movements, and their seemingly advanced technology, these were the telltale signs of time travelers. They had to be. Ethan couldn't contain his excitement. He had made a discovery, one that could change everything. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, and now, the question wasn't just about UFOs or time travel. It was about who was out there, watching, and why. Ethan spent sleepless nights poring over scientific journals and books, trying to make sense of what he had uncovered. The more he read, the more a peculiar idea began to form in his mind. If time travel was possible, even in theory, then perhaps it wasn't as impossible as most people assumed. There had to be a way for humanity to bend the rules of space and time, to move between different points in history. Theories on quantum physics and relativity began to blend together in his thoughts, creating a landscape that felt as if it was both distant and eerily close. Einstein's theory of relativity had long intrigued him, particularly the notion that time and space were not fixed. They could stretch, warp, and twist, depending on the conditions of gravity and motion. What if the UFOs weren't just machines from another planet, but vehicles designed to navigate these distortions of space-time? What if they weren't visitors from distant stars, but travelers from our own future? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more he explored, the more sense it made. Quantum physics suggested that time wasn't linear in the way humans perceived it. Instead, it was malleable, a web of probabilities and possibilities. Tiny particles, known as quantum bits or qubits, could exist in multiple states at once, a phenomenon known as superposition. This meant that time, too, could exist in multiple states, and perhaps, in some distant future, humanity had developed a technology capable of navigating that web. A civilization advanced enough to not just travel through space, but to bend the very fabric of time itself. He thought about the sightings, UFOs that defied the known laws of physics, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye, darting across the sky with movements that seemed impossible for any machine. The technology was too advanced, too perfect. It felt less like an alien presence and more like a glimpse into a future where time itself could be manipulated. UFOs in this new theory weren't simply ships from another world. They were time machines, vessels carrying humans from a future where space-time travel had become reality. The thought was staggering, yet strangely comforting. If UFOs were indeed humans from the future, then they weren't here to conquer or destroy. They were here to observe, to study the course of history, perhaps even to protect humanity from itself. Perhaps the erratic movements of the craft were not signs of alien technology, but evidence of the immense difficulty in navigating space-time without causing catastrophic disruptions. Ethan felt the weight of it all. He wasn't just chasing shadows anymore. The theory was taking shape, slowly but unmistakably. He wasn't sure what these time travelers wanted, but he was certain that the truth was closer than he had ever realized. All he had to do now was figure out how to prove it. Ethan couldn't shake the thought that had been brewing in his mind for weeks. What if the UFOs weren't just visitors from another planet, but glimpses of humanity's future? The idea was as strange as it was compelling, and the more he considered it, the more plausible it became. Time travel, once relegated to the realm of science fiction, was now a subject of serious scientific debate. Could the objects he'd witnessed in the sky actually be time machines? Could they be carrying humans from a future where time travel had not only been achieved, but perfected? He began to dive deeper into the theoretical possibilities of time travel, exploring the works of physicists and philosophers who had speculated on the nature of time for decades. One theory that stood out was the multiverse hypothesis, an idea suggesting that for every decision, for every moment, there were infinite versions of reality existing simultaneously. In a multiverse, time was not a single line, but an infinite web of timelines, each playing out differently. What if the UFOs were travelers navigating these different timelines, moving between versions of Earth and its future, trying to understand the course of history, or even to alter it? Another theory that intrigued him was the concept of parallel timelines. Could humanity's future, as it was supposed to unfold, diverge into different paths, each with its own version of the past and future? If this were the case, the UFOs could be traveling not through our timeline, but from a future version of Earth, one where time travel had allowed them to manipulate their history, or even witness it unfold in real time, just beyond their reach. The idea of timelines folding in on themselves was dizzying, but it was the only explanation that made sense when considering the erratic behavior of UFOs, their sudden appearances and disappearances. Ethan's mind kept returning to the grandfather paradox, a thought experiment that had haunted philosophers for centuries. The paradox suggested that if time travel were possible, you could, in theory, go back in time and change events, maybe even preventing your own existence. The implications of this were profound. Was humanity's future tied to a single unchanging timeline, or could actions in the future ripple back and alter the past? If time travelers were already here, observing or even subtly influencing events, could they be trying to protect their own timeline from catastrophic changes, or were they simply visitors observing, studying, with no intention of interfering? The deeper Ethan dug into these theories, the more he felt that the UFOs were not just an anomaly, but a sign of something far more complex. Could humanity, in its distant future, have reached a point where traveling through time was not just possible, but commonplace? He didn't know, but he was beginning to suspect that the truth was far stranger than he had ever imagined. Ethan spent late nights poring over ancient texts and historical accounts, searching for any clue that might tie the UFO sightings of the present day to something far older. What struck him was how often strange lights in the sky, inexplicable objects, and encounters with beings from beyond had appeared throughout history, from ancient civilizations to medieval times. In texts and drawings, there were references to chariots of fire, flaming shields, and great lights that filled the sky. These descriptions weren't unlike modern-day accounts of UFOs, and the thought occurred to him that what ancient peoples had witnessed might have been time travelers, not extraterrestrials. One particularly intriguing passage was from the Sumerian tablets, where they spoke of gods descending from the sky in vehicles that shone brightly. These gods were said to have knowledge far beyond the people of the time, possessing technology and wisdom that seemed otherworldly. But what if these weren't gods at all, but rather humans from the future traveling back to the past? Ethan had seen similar descriptions in the Bible, with Ezekiel's vision of a flying chariot, a craft described in such detail that it was impossible to ignore the possibility that the chariot wasn't a divine manifestation, but a time-traveling vessel. What fascinated Ethan most were the depictions in ancient art. In ancient Egypt, intricate carvings on tombs and temples depicted beings who appeared to be wearing helmets, with strange symbols and geometric patterns around them. These figures didn't look like gods at all. They looked like astronauts. Was it possible that these ancient artists had witnessed something far more extraordinary than they could comprehend? Time travelers who came not from the heavens, but from a distant future. Even in the ancient Americas, he found similar patterns in the art and mythologies. The Hopi people of the American Southwest spoke of star beings who had arrived from a distant time, carrying knowledge that shaped their civilization. Could this be another early encounter with humans who had traveled through time? The more Ethan read, the more he began to see a pattern. These stories were not isolated, nor were they random myths. Across different cultures and eras, there were consistent references to beings from the sky who didn't appear to be visitors from another world, but travelers from a time yet to come. Ancient texts often used metaphors, gods, angels, messengers, to explain encounters with technology and beings beyond their understanding. But what if those descriptions weren't as metaphorical as they seemed? What if the gods of old were simply humans, advanced enough to have mastered time travel, coming back to study their own past? Ethan sat back, his thoughts racing. Was it possible that humanity's greatest mysteries, the stories of gods and visitors from the stars, were not stories at all? Could they be memories of time travelers of humans like him, coming from a future he was only beginning to comprehend? It happened on a night that seemed no different from any other. Ethan had been out in his backyard, staring up at the stars, lost in the usual cosmic wonder that had fueled his late-night thinking for years. But tonight, something was different. A faint, flickering light caught his attention in the corner of his vision. At first, he thought it was just another plane, but as he focused, it became clear this was no ordinary aircraft. It moved too swiftly, too erratically, darting through the sky in sharp angles, almost as if it was deliberately defying the rules of flight. Without thinking, he grabbed his camera, hands trembling with excitement, and snapped a few shots. But the object seemed to notice him. It hovered for a moment, an eerie stillness taking over the scene, before it shot upward, vanishing into the sky faster than his eyes could follow. Ethan stood there, staring at the spot where it had been, his heart racing. Then, without warning, the world around him seemed to shift. The air around him grew thick, a strange hum vibrating in his ears. His vision blurred as a sudden dizziness overtook him, and he stumbled, trying to steady himself. What he saw next was almost impossible to describe. The world seemed to stretch and twist, as if the very fabric of space and time were unraveling. For just a few seconds, he saw flashes of a future society, one that was so advanced, it felt like a dream. Towering cities of gleaming metal and glass, with shimmering structures that defied conventional architecture. People moved in ways that seemed effortless, gliding across the ground with the aid of some technology he couldn't comprehend. Their clothing was sleek, made of materials that seemed to shimmer with a subtle iridescence. He could feel, without understanding how, that this was a society that had mastered time itself. The sensation was overwhelming, like being on the edge of a reality he couldn't fully grasp. He saw glimpses of people not from a distant past, but from a future not yet written looking at him with curiosity. They weren't surprised by his presence, but they were aware of it, as if they were watching him from behind a veil of time, observing an event in history that had yet to unfold. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sensation was gone. The world snapped back into focus, and the buzzing hum faded into silence. Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. His camera, still in his hand, had captured nothing but a blur, an empty sky. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but one thing was clear: he had glimpsed something that shouldn't have been possible. The vision of a future society, a civilization capable of bending time, was vivid and real. It wasn't a hallucination. It was as if, for a moment, time itself had reached out and touched him. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of possibilities, Had the UFO been a ship from that future, or was it merely a glimpse into something far beyond his comprehension? What if time travel wasn't just a theory, but a reality, something that humanity could one day master? The questions flooded his mind, but one thing stood out. The future wasn't just something that lay ahead of him. It had already reached back in time to touch him. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far larger at play, something that was being hidden just beyond the reach of public understanding. The UFO encounter had been a moment of awe, but it also raised a troubling question. Why wasn't anyone talking about it? Governments around the world had been aware of these phenomena for decades, yet all that came from them were vague denials and dead-end investigations. Why were they so intent on keeping the truth locked away? As he dug deeper, Ethan found himself drawn into a web of secrecy that only seemed to thicken the more he learned. The United States had long been at the center of UFO conspiracy theories, with the infamous Roswell incident being one of the most widely known, yet still never fully explained. What struck him most, however, was the lack of clarity that surrounded all the government statements on the subject. No concrete evidence had ever been made available to the public, and any official reports were typically met with vague explanations or outright dismissal. The more he read, the more he realized this wasn't a simple matter of alien visitors. This was something much deeper, an event being deliberately obscured. The silence of the governments was not just about UFOs, it was about the very fabric of time itself. Ethan began to suspect that the reason why these extraterrestrial phenomena were being suppressed wasn't because of their origins, but because of their implications for humanity's understanding of time. The possibility that UFOs were not visitors from another planet, but travelers from our own future, was a theory too dangerous to allow the public to entertain. If time travel was real, the consequences were mind-boggling. What did it mean for history, for free will? What kind of control could future civilizations exert over the course of our present reality? As he continued his research, Ethan came across whistleblower accounts from former government officials, each one more compelling than the last. These insiders spoke of encounters with crafts that defied the laws of physics, of data and evidence that had been buried deep within classified files, and of a government that was constantly playing catch-up with something it couldn't explain. It was clear that what was being hidden wasn't just technology or alien life, but the very concept of time itself. He thought back to the words of one of the whistleblowers, a former high-ranking officer who had once worked on secret UFO investigations. "They know the truth," the officer had said. "They know we're being watched, and they know we're being shaped by something, someone, from the future." The officer had paused, a look of deep concern crossing their face, before adding, "Time is a weapon, and it's being used against us." Ethan couldn't help but shiver as he realized how far-reaching the implications were. The silence from the governments wasn't just about hiding the truth about UFOs. It was about protecting humanity from the overwhelming reality of what time travel meant. The question wasn't just about whether UFOs were real. It was about why the governments were so desperate to keep their mouths shut. What were they so afraid of? Ethan had spent countless nights staring at the stars, dissecting theories and piecing together clues, but nothing could have prepared him for the encounter that awaited him. It was a warm evening when it happened, the kind of night that felt as though time itself had slowed down, leaving only the rustling of the trees and the hum of distant city lights. He was sitting outside, his gaze lost in the sky, when a figure approached from the shadows. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. The figure seemed to shimmer in the air, as though the space around them bent and rippled. But as it drew closer, the outline of a person became unmistakable, tall, dressed in dark, unremarkable clothes, and with eyes that seemed to hold a strange, unsettling knowledge. Ethan stood up, heart pounding in his chest. "You've been looking for answers," the figure said, their voice calm, yet carrying an eerie weight. Ethan froze, unsure of how to react. "Who are you?" The person stepped closer, their expression unreadable. Someone who knows more about time than you could ever imagine. Ethan's mind raced. Was this a prank? A government agent trying to intimidate him into silence? But something about the person's presence felt different. It wasn't just their words, it was the way they carried themselves, like someone who had witnessed centuries, who had seen the vastness of history unfold and collapse in a single moment. I'm looking into UFOs, Ethan said hesitantly. Time travel too. The figure nodded slowly. And you've come to the conclusion that they are connected. UFOs aren't visitors from other planets. They're visitors from your own future. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his theories, let alone the possibility that UFOs could be time travelers. How did this person know? You think you're the first to have this thought? The figure continued, their eyes gleaming with a depth that unnerved him. Time travel has been a part of humanity's future for far longer than you've realized. The ships you see, the lights you chase, they're not alien. They are us. Ethan's mind spun, trying to reconcile the impossible with the theory he had been investigating for so long. But why? Why come back? Why us? To observe, to protect, to learn from the mistakes of the past, the figure replied, their voice tinged with sorrow. You're on the edge of something monumental, Ethan. What you're starting to uncover, it could change everything. But be careful. There are forces who would prefer that this knowledge stay hidden. Ethan took a step back, his thoughts colliding in a chaotic blur. What are you saying? Who are you really? The figure smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm someone who came to help you understand, but only if you're ready to listen. Time has already been altered. You're already a part of something bigger than you realize. Before Ethan could respond, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his mind racing with the weight of their words. Ethan sat in the dim light of his study, surrounded by the scattered pages of notes, books, and photographs. His mind was in turmoil, spinning with questions that only seemed to deepen with every passing hour. He had come face to face with someone who claimed to be from the future, and yet, the enormity of what that meant was still beyond his grasp. If time travel was real, then how did it all work? How could people from the future come back without completely unraveling the past? He ran his fingers through his hair, the weight of the paradoxes pressing down on him. It was a theory that had plagued scientists and philosophers for centuries, the idea that traveling back in time would create a cascade of changes, rippling through history, altering the present in unimaginable ways. The grandfather paradox was the most famous of these, the thought experiment where a time traveler might go back and prevent their own grandfather from meeting their grandmother, thus erasing their own existence. Ethan had always dismissed it as just a theory, a thought experiment to spark debates, not a reality to be worried about. But now, standing on the precipice of something much bigger, it felt like the very nature of time was shifting beneath him. Could it be that the future had somehow learned to avoid these paradoxes? Was there a way to travel without altering the past, without making any catastrophic changes? Ethan thought about the strange figure from the night before, the cryptic words they had spoken about observation, protection, and learning from past mistakes. Perhaps the travelers weren't trying to change history, they were merely studying it, ensuring that humanity's mistakes didn't repeat themselves. Perhaps they had learned how to sidestep the very threads of time, navigating them with a precision that no one else could comprehend. He pulled up his computer, scrolling through more reports of UFO sightings, looking for patterns that might explain the nature of these visits. Were there moments in time when these visitors appeared, only to disappear just as quickly? Ethan wondered if the time travelers had figured out a way to slip in and out of history, interacting without leaving a trace. The more he read, the more the pieces began to fit, but there was still a gap, a place he couldn't quite bridge. The theory of parallel timelines started to come to mind. What if the future didn't just come back to observe history, but to ensure it stayed on track? Perhaps there were multiple timelines, each one a thread in a much larger fabric of existence. The future could step in, nudge things ever so slightly, but never too much, to ensure that one timeline remained intact. But how could he prove any of this? What was the real mechanism behind time travel? And how did these travelers avoid the colossal risks of paradoxes? Ethan's thoughts swirled in frustration, the answers just beyond his reach. He knew one thing for certain: the more he uncovered, the more he realized how little he understood. Time itself, it seemed, was the greatest mystery of all. Ethan had spent hours, days even, combing through UFO sightings, trying to find a pattern that might explain the strange behavior he'd witnessed himself. The inconsistencies in reports, the sudden appearances, the rapid departures, and the unexplained maneuvers seemed too deliberate, too intentional. If UFOs weren't alien ships from distant galaxies, what if they were something more paradoxical? What if they were from the future? He leaned over his desk. A map of UFO sightings from the last 50 years spread across it. Some were isolated incidents in rural towns, while others occurred in densely populated cities. Some sightings lasted for minutes, others just a fleeting second. But there was one common thread that he couldn't ignore: their timing. It wasn't random. These visitors, if they were time travelers, seemed to appear during moments of great change, on the cusp of something monumental. Ethan clicked through a series of photographs and reports, each one more puzzling than the last. There was the strange aerial phenomenon over Washington, D.C. in 1952, a series of UFOs observed just hours before a major political speech, or the wave of sightings in 1967, coinciding with the first human walk on the moon. In every instance, the UFOs seemed to be present but never interfered, always watching, always lingering just outside the bounds of the significant moment. The thought lingered in Ethan's mind: what if they weren't there to intervene? What if their purpose was simply to observe? He shifted in his chair, the image of the UFO from his own encounter still vivid in his mind. He recalled its movements, too calculated and too graceful to be anything from this era. Could it have been part of a larger system, a kind of observation protocol designed not to disrupt history, but to study it? The more he reviewed the evidence, the more it seemed like these visitors were tracking the evolution of humanity, witnessing our most defining moments without ever touching them. Ethan opened a new file on his computer, his eyes scanning the timeline of human history. Was it possible that these UFOs appeared at moments when humanity stood at a crossroads? Perhaps they were documenting decisions, behaviors, and outcomes, maybe even trying to learn from our failures, adjusting their approach to the future. The sudden flurry of activity in the 1940s and 1950s after World War II felt especially deliberate. Something changed during that time. Something shifted in the global landscape, and it was around that time that UFOs started to become a familiar part of the modern lexicon. He thought back to the words of the time traveler he'd met. History is fragile. You must be careful with what you see. What if their presence was simply to ensure that humanity stayed on the right path, that the course of history was not derailed by the actions of those who didn't understand the full consequences of their decisions? As Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the theory settled in. These UFOs weren't just exploring the universe, they were exploring time itself. And in doing so, they were quietly witnessing the story of humanity unfold, preserving it, watching it, but never truly altering it. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the UFO from his mind. It had been too advanced, too precise. He had seen it up close, its sleek metallic surface reflecting the moonlight, its form shifting in ways that defied the basic laws of physics. The movements were almost effortless, like it was floating on an unseen cushion of air, gliding without the need for propulsion in the conventional sense. As he scrolled through more reports of UFO encounters, one thing became abundantly clear. These craft were not just advanced, they were decades, perhaps even centuries, ahead of anything humanity had produced. The propulsion system alone was unlike anything found on Earth. From the way these crafts hovered and accelerated, it was as if they weren't bound by the same limitations that kept terrestrial technology grounded. No visible exhaust, no sonic booms, no engines visible to the naked eye, just a quiet, impossible movement. Even in his most optimistic projections, the technology necessary to achieve such feats was far beyond what any current nation could achieve. Ethan leaned back, his mind racing through the implications. If the UFOs were indeed time travelers, then the technology they wielded had to have originated from a society that had already mastered time travel. The energy needed to traverse the vast stretches of time was astronomical, and it seemed likely that this technology was just the tip of the iceberg. What if these crafts were part of a much larger system? What if they weren't just vehicles, but mobile hubs of technological innovation, carrying advanced tools and machinery far beyond human comprehension? He could only imagine the implications of such technology. A ship that could move through time itself would require a profound understanding of quantum mechanics, space-time manipulation, and energy generation that had yet to be conceived by human minds. The more Ethan read about these sightings, the more convinced he became that these were not alien ships, but human creations from a distant future, a future where technology had evolved to levels we could scarcely imagine. Perhaps the technology they had witnessed was merely a glimpse of what was possible when humanity reached the pinnacle of its potential. Time travel might not only be a mode of transportation, it could represent an entire paradigm shift in how humans interacted with reality itself. What if these crafts were not simply vehicles to transport people across time, but sophisticated machines capable of collecting, analyzing, and even altering the course of history? The thought was almost too much to process. A future society not only capable of traveling through time but also so advanced in their technological capabilities that the laws of physics as we understood them no longer applied. If time travel was common in the future, perhaps these time travelers weren't here by accident. They were showing Ethan a world where the impossible had been made real, where the line between science fiction and reality had been permanently blurred. The technology of the future was already here, but it wasn't just an invention, it was a window into humanity's far-flung destiny. Ethan spent weeks buried in books, papers, and scientific journals, trying to piece together an explanation for the temporal distortions he had experienced. The encounter with the UFO had left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Whatever had happened, it didn't fit within the conventional boundaries of physics. If he was going to understand what was happening, he needed to approach it from a scientific perspective, something rigorous, grounded, yet open to the extraordinary. The first step was to delve into the field of space-time, the very fabric that governed everything from the largest galaxies to the tiniest subatomic particles. According to the most advanced theories of relativity, time could be manipulated through extreme gravitational fields or intense energy fluctuations, just as black holes bent time itself, creating a distorted bubble around them. But could these distortions, these anomalous rifts in the fabric of space-time, be induced by something less destructive, something more controlled? Could UFOs be exploiting this to travel through time? Ethan set up a rudimentary experiment, using a modified quantum clock to measure fluctuations in local space-time. It wasn't the kind of setup that would impress the scientific community, but it was a start. He carefully recorded the rate at which time seemed to pass, measuring any deviation from the norm. At first, the data was inconclusive. There were small, almost imperceptible variations, nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual background noise. But as he fine-tuned the equipment and waited for longer periods, something caught his eye. The subtle, yet persistent, distortion. The numbers weren't supposed to fluctuate like this. Time, as he understood it, should have been steady and uniform, at least in a local environment. But the clock's readings were jumping, just slightly, every few minutes. The patterns were irregular, but still present. Almost like tiny pockets of space-time were warping, ever so briefly, before snapping back into place. Ethan expanded his experiment, measuring across a wider range of frequencies. He began to suspect that these fluctuations weren't random at all, but deliberate, created by some force, something intelligent. He reviewed old UFO reports, searching for any connection between the sightings and disturbances in space-time. There it was again, time anomalies. There were accounts of people losing track of time, of UFOs appearing and disappearing in ways that seemed impossible to follow. His mind raced. Could UFOs be exploiting these distortions in space-time to navigate through time itself? Perhaps they weren't just traveling through the physical realm, but through different moments in history, shifting between past and future, without disturbing the underlying timeline. It was a chilling thought if true. They had mastered the ability to exist outside the linear progression of time, able to visit any moment without leaving a trace. The implications were staggering. He couldn't prove it, not yet, but as the measurements continued to reveal more anomalies, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, was he witnessing the first tangible evidence of time travelers? And if so, what were they looking for in the past, and why had they chosen now to reveal themselves? As Ethan's research deepened, so did the troubling questions. The more he uncovered, the less clear the moral landscape became. If UFOs were indeed time travelers, if they were humans from the future, then what was their purpose? Were they simply observers, silently watching as history unfolded? Or were they here for something more profound, perhaps, to protect the timeline or manipulate it for reasons he couldn't yet understand? The possibility that they might be monitoring the past was unsettling. What if they were not just watching, but intervening in subtle ways to ensure the future unfolded as it should? He thought back to the odd encounter he'd had, the strange, fleeting glimpse of a future society. Could they be trying to prevent catastrophic events that might have altered their existence? It felt like a delicate balance, one that teetered on the edge of ethics and necessity. What if certain key moments in history had to play out exactly as they had, with no deviations, no interference, to preserve the course of humanity? The more Ethan considered it, the more complicated the situation became. Time travel, in theory, was a dangerous and messy affair. The risks of paradoxes, of unintentional changes to the timeline, were well documented in fiction. But here, now, he was faced with the very real possibility that future humans were engaged in this delicate balancing act. Could it be that they had the power to reshape history, if only subtly, and that, somehow, this had become their responsibility? Ethan couldn't help but wonder about the potential consequences of knowing too much. What if the very act of him uncovering this truth had somehow disrupted the timeline, setting off a chain reaction that could alter everything? What if, in seeking answers, he was unknowingly putting the future at risk? Was it better not to know, to leave the past undisturbed, untouched by the curiosity of the present? On the other hand, he could feel the pull of something greater. The truth had always been his guiding force. If the future was indeed observing the past, manipulating events to preserve the flow of history, then who was he, or anyone, to stand in the way of such a monumental responsibility? Could humanity be trusted to understand its place in the broader, intricate web of time? Or was there a reason the future had kept its secrets hidden, and that the truth had remained out of reach? Ethan found himself wrestling with the weight of these questions, his mind spinning in uncertainty. He couldn't escape the paradox of it all. The more he learned, the less he was sure of. Time travel had always been a concept confined to the realm of theory and fiction, but now, with evidence pointing to its existence, Ethan felt a deep, nagging sense of dread. What if knowing the truth about time travel and UFOs meant uncovering a reality he wasn't ready to accept? What if the future was not the answer but the ultimate dilemma? It started slowly, just fleeting glimpses in the corner of his vision, like shadows shifting in the periphery of his waking mind. At first, Ethan thought it was exhaustion, the kind that comes after days of intense research and too many sleepless nights spent poring over UFO sightings and time travel theories. But soon, the dreams began to grow more vivid, more frequent. He could no longer dismiss them as mere fragments of imagination. The first dream was small, almost inconsequential. He was standing on a crowded street, the sky above darkening with strange, swirling clouds that didn't belong. People were moving around him, but no one seemed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. He reached for his phone to check the time, but the screen flickered, showing a date that was decades in the future. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the vision, but before he could, everything collapsed into an overwhelming blur of colors and noise. The next one came days later. This time, he was inside a building, and there was a sense of urgency, a quiet panic that ran through him. The walls were cold and metallic, not unlike the descriptions of UFOs he had read about. A woman, older but familiar, stood in front of him, her face calm yet filled with a depth of knowing that unsettled him. She spoke in cryptic phrases, telling him that history would change and that his role in it was crucial. Before he could ask her anything, she was gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in her wake. The dreams continued to escalate in intensity, each one offering fragmented glimpses of the future clocks that spun backward, cities in ruins, and people in strange, unfamiliar clothing. There was a constant feeling of displacement, as though Ethan himself was caught in the flow of time, torn between past, present, and future. He awoke each morning drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with a feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of reality. There were moments when the line between his waking life and the dreams blurred. He would pass by a familiar street corner, only to feel a sudden rush of déjà vu as the vision from his dream played out before him. The same dark clouds, the same sense of panic, the same woman's face, now hauntingly real in the daylight. Ethan couldn't ignore the connection. These dreams weren't random. They felt like messages, like fragments of a puzzle being slowly pieced together. He wasn't sure whether they were a result of his close proximity to the UFO sightings, or if they were somehow caused by the temporal distortions he had been studying. But one thing was clear: his belief in time-traveling humans had been solidified. These weren't just dreams, they were visions, glimpses of the future, fragments of a timeline that hadn't yet fully unfolded. As he lay awake in the silence of his room, the realization settled in. He wasn't just studying time travel anymore. He was living it. The future was reaching out to him, trying to tell him something, and he wasn't sure whether he was ready to hear it. As Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the theories he had collected over the months felt overwhelming. UFO sightings, government cover-ups, unexplained phenomena, all of it had led him down a path he never expected. At first, he had been drawn to the idea of extraterrestrials. The stories of strange ships and beings from distant stars had fascinated him since childhood. But as his research deepened, the patterns began to shift, and he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. He flipped through his notes, the evidence stacking up against the idea of aliens. The classic UFO sightings were always described in vague terms: glowing lights, strange shapes, rapid movements, none of which could be conclusively linked to any technology we currently understood. Yet, there was something undeniably human about them. The crafts, though advanced, didn't seem entirely foreign to the planet they hovered above. They displayed an intelligence, a precision, that suggested something familiar, something that could be a product of Earth's own future. The idea slowly took root. What if these UFOs weren't from distant galaxies, but from a future humanity, one that had mastered the art of time travel? Perhaps the strange lights in the sky, the elusive ships that defied all logic, weren't extraterrestrial visitors at all. Perhaps they were humans, or descendants of humans, returning from a future civilization, slipping through time, and observing the past in ways we couldn't understand. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a lingering question. If UFOs were indeed humans from the future, how had they traveled back in time? And why? Was it merely for observation, or was there a deeper purpose? He sifted through the evidence he had gathered, the ancient texts, the sightings, the bizarre reports of UFOs being seen near pivotal moments in history. These weren't just coincidences. It felt too structured, too intentional. The idea that these UFOs were visitors from the future began to make sense in a way that the alien hypothesis never could. He thought about the technological advancements described in UFO reports, ships that could seemingly defy the laws of physics, make impossible maneuvers, and travel faster than anything humans could build today. It wasn't so much that these crafts were beyond us, it was that they were beyond us now, in this moment. If time travel was possible, then the technology didn't have to be from an alien race. It could easily belong to a civilization that had advanced far beyond the limits of current understanding, one that had evolved out of humanity itself. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, as comforting and exciting as it had once seemed, now felt like a misunderstanding of the true nature of these visitors. Perhaps the reason the UFOs remained so elusive, so cryptic, was because they were simply too familiar. They were humans, or humans-to-be, trapped in time, observing us without interfering. Perhaps they had their own reasons for remaining hidden, for keeping their true identity a secret. Or maybe they were just watching, waiting for a moment when the past and the future would finally converge in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. The more Ethan thought about it, the more the evidence pointed in this direction. The UFOs weren't aliens from faraway stars. They were us, from the future. Ethan spent countless nights grappling with the concept of time travel. The more he uncovered, the more complex the implications became. He found himself wrestling with a set of ethical questions that hadn't crossed his mind when he first delved into the mystery of UFOs. The possibility that these visitors from the future were, in fact, human time travelers raised questions far beyond the simple mechanics of time travel. It was no longer just about observing history. It was about the responsibility that came with it. If these time travelers were observing the past, were they operating under a strict code of non-interference? After all, in many time travel theories, there was a belief that meddling with the past could unravel the very fabric of the future. Ethan had read about the prime directive in science fiction, the idea that time travelers, or those with advanced knowledge of time, must not alter or influence events in history. It seemed like a noble, almost sacred rule, but as he pondered it further, the more complicated it seemed. What if these travelers weren't just watching? What if they had a reason to be here, a reason they weren't sharing with the rest of humanity? The thought gnawed at him, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He started to question their motives. Were these future humans truly committed to preserving the timeline, or was there something more sinister at play? The notion that they were simply passive observers began to feel naive. Could there be a deeper agenda at work? Perhaps they weren't just monitoring history for the sake of knowledge. What if they were shaping events, guiding humanity in subtle ways? History was full of moments when the course of events had been altered, some small, some massive, and those moments often had unforeseen consequences. Could time travelers be making small changes, not to disrupt the grand flow of time, but to ensure that their future, the one they had come from, was preserved? The more Ethan explored, the more the potential for manipulation became apparent. Time travel opened up a Pandora's box of moral dilemmas. If humanity could travel to the past, who would be the ones deciding what to preserve and what to change? The power to shape history was a dangerous thing, even if it was wrapped in the guise of benevolence. The ethical responsibility of time travelers, whether they were keeping the timeline intact or influencing it for their own reasons, weighed heavily on him. And then there was the issue of consent. Were the people of the past even aware that they were being watched or studied? Were they unknowingly subjects of a great experiment, their lives playing out under the gaze of distant future beings? It felt wrong to Ethan, this idea of a future humanity shaping history in secret. They may be acting under the guise of protection or preservation, but could they truly be trusted? The question lingered. If time travel was real, were the future humans operating with the best intentions, or were they using their knowledge of time for reasons far more self-serving? As Ethan sifted through more historical accounts of UFO sightings, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. He noted the strange consistency with which these encounters seemed to occur during pivotal moments in history, moments that shaped the course of human civilization. It was as if these visitors from the future had an uncanny habit of appearing when the world teetered on the edge of significant change. Whether it was during moments of great war, political upheaval, or technological advancement, the sky seemed to be filled with strange lights, unexplainable craft, and inexplicable phenomena. One such moment stood out in his mind, the sighting of an unidentified flying object just hours before the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. According to several accounts, a strange craft had been observed in the sky by multiple individuals on the eve of that fateful day. Was this a coincidence, or had the visitors from the future known what was about to transpire? Ethan wondered if these time travelers were watching, perhaps waiting to see if humanity could withstand such a destructive turning point. But then again, if they were simply observing, why make their presence known at all? As he dug deeper, Ethan uncovered more cases. UFOs reported during pivotal political events, such as the signing of the Magna Carta, the rise of the Renaissance, and even the fall of empires. These occurrences seemed too frequent to be mere coincidence, too deliberate in their timing to suggest randomness. The more he examined these historical interventions, the more he began to wonder, were these UFOs truly just passive observers, or were they actively intervening in human history? It was hard to say for sure, but Ethan couldn't ignore the possibility that these time travelers weren't just watching history unfold, they were possibly guiding it. What if they had been present during moments of great discovery or change, subtly nudging humanity in one direction or another? He thought about the implications of such a theory. If time travelers were influencing major historical events, who decided when and why? Was there a grand design at work, an attempt to steer humanity toward a particular future? Or were these time travelers simply acting on the whim of a few individuals, making small alterations to ensure their own existence? He recalled a peculiar observation in the accounts of UFO sightings during the space race. The Soviet Union and the United States had each reported strange objects in the sky during critical launches and technological milestones, each of which had brought humanity closer to exploring the cosmos. Were these extraterrestrials guiding our space exploration, or was there a more personal involvement from a future civilization? The idea that these time travelers could have been subtly influencing the race to space, ensuring that humanity reached certain technological thresholds, felt strangely plausible to Ethan. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like these historical interventions weren't random at all. They were deliberate, calculated, perhaps part of a larger plan. But who was behind this plan, and to what end? The mystery deepened with every passing day, and the possibility that these events were not merely coincidences but carefully crafted nudges from the future began to take root in his mind. Ethan's obsession with the possibility of time travel had pushed him further than he ever expected to go. The more he read about quantum mechanics, the more he became convinced that there was some link between the strange occurrences surrounding UFO sightings and the fabric of reality itself. He had long suspected that if time travel was real, it wouldn't be a simple matter of traveling through space. It would require manipulating the very laws of physics, bending space and time in ways that defied the understanding of even the brightest minds. The more he delved into the theories of quantum entanglement and parallel universes, the more his mind raced. He had read about the possibility of creating wormholes, tunnels through the fabric of space-time that could potentially connect different points in time. But he also began to entertain the idea that it might not just be the time travelers who could manipulate these phenomena. What if ordinary people could learn to perceive or even travel through these temporal pathways, given the right technology and knowledge? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a breakthrough in his research. He had been experimenting with a small device that could theoretically amplify quantum fluctuations, allowing him to manipulate the quantum field in such a way that he might be able to experience a brief moment of altered time perception. It was a shot in the dark, a far cry from the sophisticated technologies that could actually enable time travel, but he had to try. The device, a rudimentary quantum generator cobbled together with parts from various old experiments and cutting-edge components he'd scavenged, hummed quietly on his workbench. Taking a deep breath, he activated the machine. The room around him seemed to shimmer for a moment, as though the walls themselves were warping in and out of focus. Then, it hit him, the familiar sensation of disorientation, a tingling sensation on the back of his neck, like his perception of time itself was slipping. It lasted for only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, Ethan felt as though he was not just in his room, but also somewhere else, perhaps in another time or reality. The sensation was fleeting but vivid, like a sudden flash of insight into a world that existed beyond the present. His heart raced. It wasn't much, but it was something, a confirmation of sorts. He had felt it, something beyond the ordinary flow of time, something that hinted at the very mechanics of time travel. The brief glimpse into another time, another reality, felt so real. He couldn't explain it, but he had the distinct feeling that this was just the beginning. His experiments were no longer abstract ideas. They were beginning to yield results that could point to something far greater. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. Over the next few days, the device seemed to generate more subtle effects. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, as if parts of the room were momentarily out of sync with the present. Time itself appeared to waver, causing brief moments of déjà vu, where events seemed to repeat or loop in strange ways. Ethan could no longer deny it. He was on the verge of something extraordinary, and the clues were stacking up in a way he could no longer ignore. He wasn't just studying UFOs and time travel anymore, he was experiencing them firsthand. Ethan's search for answers had brought him to a place he never expected to be. In his pursuit of understanding UFOs and time travel, he uncovered something far more unsettling, an experiment gone wrong, one that had been forgotten by history. It was a theory, a whispered rumor in the scientific community, dismissed as nothing more than a conspiracy. But as he pieced together the fragments of old research papers, archival footage, and cryptic journal entries from long-forgotten physicists, Ethan began to see a darker side to the story of time travel. The experiment had begun in the 1950s, a secret initiative to explore the possibilities of not only traveling through time, but also of manipulating dimensions themselves. The idea was simple in theory but complex in practice. What if humans could not only visit the past or future, but could jump between different parallel realities, shifting from one version of time to another? The project, codenamed Chronos, had been led by some of the brightest minds of the era, funded by a shadowy organization within the government, and initially hailed as the future of scientific discovery. But something had gone wrong. Ethan traced the experiment's descent into chaos to an unexpected breakthrough. The team, eager to explore beyond the boundaries of their understanding, had accidentally opened a rift, a tear between dimensions. In their attempt to travel through time, they had inadvertently triggered a cascade of events that led to the collapse of the very fabric they were trying to manipulate. The result was catastrophic. Some of the researchers vanished without a trace, while others reported seeing visions of strange, otherworldly landscapes, flickers of possible futures, perhaps, or alternate realities. The most chilling discovery was that a handful of these time travelers had returned, but not as the people they once were. There were reports of strange individuals, rogue agents, as they were called, who had come back from their interdimensional journeys, their memories fractured, their minds altered. These rogue travelers seemed different, colder, as though the experience of slipping through multiple realities had left them with a sense of detachment. Some had even claimed to be from a future far beyond what anyone could have imagined, speaking cryptically of events that had yet to unfold. Ethan's heart pounded as he examined the files, piecing together the chilling implications. What if the UFOs people were seeing these strange ships that appeared out of nowhere, sometimes hovering over landmarks, sometimes darting through the sky, were the result of this failed experiment? What if these rogue time travelers, or their descendants, were still out there, moving between timelines, observing humanity from the future? Could they be monitoring us, watching our evolution, perhaps even intervening in ways they thought we couldn't comprehend? The weight of the revelation settled in Ethan's chest. The UFOs weren't just visitors from space, they were shadows from the future, remnants of an experiment long forgotten, yet still reaching into the present, bending the rules of time itself. The mystery was bigger than he had ever imagined, and now there was no turning back. Ethan had always been a lover of patterns, the way numbers and shapes could create order from chaos. But the more he studied the UFO sightings meticulously documented, cataloged in old newspapers, online forums, and even government files, the more he began to see something strange, something consistent that had escaped most other researchers. It wasn't just the physical shape of the UFOs or their erratic movements. There was something deeper, a subtle signature woven through the sightings, like a hidden code embedded within the events themselves. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Some sightings clustered around specific dates, while others occurred in synchronicity with world events, political shifts, scientific breakthroughs, and even natural disasters. Ethan was about to dismiss it as a strange anomaly when a pattern within the pattern began to emerge. There was a mathematical rhythm to the appearances, an almost deliberate consistency. The more he dug into the data, the more he saw connections. UFOs seemed to appear in intervals, not random, but based on cycles, an unspoken sequence that appeared to follow no known pattern of logic, yet carried with it an undeniable sense of order. He took to his board again, marking out the dates, the locations, the times, and the durations of the sightings. Each was a piece of a puzzle, a coded message waiting to be deciphered. With each connection, Ethan began to feel the weight of what he was about to uncover. The idea that UFOs might not just be physical phenomena but part of a larger, more complex system of time manipulation was growing stronger in his mind. What if these sightings were not random at all? What if they were deliberately placed, positioned in a sequence that made sense only to those who understood the key? The more Ethan worked, the more he began to see a message forming a temporal code. It wasn't just the moments in time, but how they connected, when the ships appeared, and how their behavior seemed to align with certain shifts in human history. The code was there, woven between the sightings, a time-based encryption he was just beginning to crack. He started to see these events not just as anomalies in the sky, but as temporal markers, moments where the fabric of time itself had been nudged or twisted. They weren't random appearances of extraterrestrial life. They were moments of deliberate observation or even intervention from future humans, using a pattern of occurrence to track significant turning points in history. The UFOs weren't just visiting. They were observing pivotal moments, acting as timekeepers, watching for when humanity might need a nudge or perhaps a warning. Ethan was on the brink of something bigger than just decoding a pattern. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. The code wasn't just for observation. It was a map, a blueprint of sorts, a roadmap of temporal events designed to be understood by someone who could decode it, someone with enough knowledge to manipulate time. The UFOs were communicating. They were telling him something, but the full meaning was just out of reach. With a mixture of excitement and fear, Ethan leaned in closer to his board. The timeline of UFO sightings spread out before him. It was no longer just a mystery of alien life. It was a mystery of time itself. He had to crack the code, not just for his own understanding, but for the truth hidden within the fabric of history and the future. As Ethan pored over the increasing stack of data before him, a thought began to creep into his mind, subtle at first, but soon undeniable. What if the UFOs he'd been studying were not just time travelers from a single, linear future, but rather visitors from multiple realities? What if the timeline he was so focused on wasn't the only one, but merely one version of many possible outcomes, each with its own set of events, each inhabited by different versions of humanity? The idea sent a shiver down his spine, as it seemed both far-fetched and strangely plausible. He had always been cautious with his theories, hesitant to leap into the realm of the truly speculative, but this thought kept resurfacing. It was clear that the UFOs didn't fit neatly into the framework of conventional time travel, where one set future governed everything. They appeared at different points in history, under different conditions, and often with an air of detachment, as if they were watching, but never truly intervening. What if they weren't just watching one timeline, but several, coming from multiple futures, each diverging and evolving in its own way? Each timeline had its own set of rules, its own consequences, and perhaps its own need for intervention. Ethan began to test the theory. Using the patterns he'd uncovered in previous sightings, he expanded his approach. If there were multiple realities at play, he reasoned, then perhaps the UFOs didn't just follow one path. Instead, they might be accessing different versions of humanity, choosing which one to visit based on certain variables, whether it was an alternate history, a catastrophic event in one reality, or even a tipping point in another. Maybe the UFOs were crossing between parallel realities, searching for answers, observing how different versions of humanity handled the same crisis, or even interfering to make sure one reality survived at the expense of another. Ethan created a new set of simulations based on his new hypothesis. If these time travelers were coming from multiple futures, their appearances could be aligned not just with time as it was known, but with the potential for different outcomes. Each version of the future would have its own set of variables. What happened if certain historical events were different in one timeline? What happened if a seemingly small event in one world led to a drastically different future in another? He started to look for parallels in the sightings, small anomalies that might suggest a change in the pattern based on which reality the UFOs had emerged from. The more he tested, the more the idea gained momentum. He wasn't just observing one timeline. He was looking at a web of infinite possibilities, threads of reality tangled together, each influencing the other. The UFOs were not just watching one outcome, they were navigating this web, experiencing and altering history in ways they might not fully understand, or perhaps were never meant to. Ethan's mind raced as he considered the implications. What if the UFOs were trying to correct mistakes made in one timeline by intervening in another? What if they were not only travelers through time but travelers between realities, managing the balance of history across parallel worlds? He had entered into a realm of theory so vast, so uncharted, that it felt as though everything he had known about time and space was a mere surface, waiting to be scratched open. Ethan sat in his small, cluttered study, the hum of his computer filling the silence. He had just returned from another long night of sifting through UFO sightings, but something felt off, like the air had thickened, or the walls were closing in. He hadn't expected the message to come now, and certainly not in the way it did. At first, it appeared to be a glitch, a sudden pop-up on his screen that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The text was faint, as if the words had been written in a hurry, almost as though the sender was afraid of being caught. The message read, "Stop. You are on the wrong path. Some truths should never be uncovered. There are consequences you can't predict. Do not look further." Ethan leaned forward, his heart quickening. The words, though unsettling, weren't exactly a surprise. He had been expecting something like this, the warning he'd heard in his dreams, the sense that he was being watched, that something larger than him was at play. But the source of the message sent a shiver down his spine. Was it from someone who knew what he was doing? Or worse, was it from a future version of himself, desperate to stop him from continuing? He stood up, pacing the room, the tension building inside him like an electric current. He had always suspected that delving deeper into the mysteries of time travel, of UFOs, could come with risks. After all, what kind of beings would be watching him so intently? He had speculated about future versions of humanity, but what if this was the truth staring him in the face? What if it wasn't just about monitoring the past, but preventing certain people from unearthing the most dangerous knowledge of all the truth about their existence? The more he thought about it, the more paranoid the idea seemed. What if this warning was real? What if these time travelers, whether human or not, were aware of his progress and didn't want him to go any further? Could he trust the message, or was it just another attempt to throw him off track? Ethan's mind raced as he tried to piece together the significance of it all. Every time he'd uncovered a new detail, something had tried to halt his progress. Odd occurrences, strangers staring at him in public, strange figures at the edge of his vision, fleeting like shadows in the corner of his mind. But this, it felt more real, more immediate. The feeling of being watched intensified, and he couldn't shake the sense that his every move was being calculated. The warning, however cryptic, was clear enough. Someone, or something, didn't want him to continue. And yet, the part of him that refused to let go, the part that had spent years chasing these questions, told him that he couldn't stop now. The danger was part of the mystery. The deeper he dug, the closer he would get to the truth, no matter the cost. With a determined breath, Ethan turned back to the screen. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever he had uncovered, it wasn't enough. The search had only just begun. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit study, the cool glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the room. The cryptic message had shaken him to the core, but he knew there was no turning back. If he was going to find the truth, he had to confront what he had been avoiding, the true intentions of the time travelers. Up until now, everything had been a series of theories, fragmented pieces he had desperately tried to make sense of. He had assumed that they were simply observers, coming from the future, to watch, to study. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that there was a distinct pattern in the sightings, something far more deliberate. These visitors weren't just monitoring, they were interacting. The question now wasn't whether time travel existed, it was why they had chosen to show themselves to him. As he thought about the future versions of humanity, the future he had glimpsed in his strange encounters, a new possibility emerged. What if the time travelers weren't just scientists or curious wanderers from a distant tomorrow? What if they had a deeper purpose, one tied to the fate of the Earth? His mind raced, drawing connections between all the strange events that had occurred in the last few months. The unexplained UFO sightings, the whispers of intervention, the messages, had they all been part of a larger plan? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the time travelers had an agenda. But what was it? Was it to guide humanity toward a better future? Or was it something far darker? The warnings, the cryptic messages, and the feeling of being watched suggested that there was far more at stake. He remembered the strange sensation he'd had during his close encounters, the unmistakable feeling of being manipulated, as if they were aware of his every move. He had once thought that their silence was because they didn't want to interfere with the timeline, but now he wasn't so sure. The possibility that these travelers weren't simply observers, but active participants in shaping Earth's future, was terrifying. He had seen enough in his research to know that humanity's future was fragile, filled with challenges that would test the limits of survival. Could the time travelers be here to push humanity in a particular direction, to guide the outcome of critical events in history? Or worse, were they here to ensure that the mistakes of the past were repeated? Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of questions and theories. The more he pondered, the more it became clear. The time travelers weren't here for the reasons he had once believed. They had an agenda, a purpose that went beyond observation. And that purpose, whatever it was, could change the course of history, perhaps even the very fate of the Earth itself. He had come too far to stop now, but the truth was more elusive and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Time travelers might not just be watching humanity's future, they might be shaping it. Ethan's heart raced as he sat across from the figure, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls of the small, cluttered room. The man before him looked strangely familiar, yet distant, almost as though he were a reflection of a version of himself from some alternate timeline. He had seen this person in his dreams, in his visions, but never in real life, at least, not until now. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Ethan," the man said softly, his voice calm, almost too calm. "The truth isn't what you think. There's more to this than time travel. Much more." Ethan blinked, trying to make sense of the words. He had been chasing the answers for so long, but nothing in his research had prepared him for what was unfolding before him. This wasn't just another cryptic message or vague warning. This man, this figure, was part of something larger, a much larger plan. And it was now, finally, becoming clear. The man continued, his eyes unwavering. "We are the temporal guardians. Our job is to protect the timeline, to ensure that history unfolds as it should. Without us, the consequences would be catastrophic. The events you've witnessed, the UFOs, the anomalies, the disturbances in space-time, they aren't accidents. They're disruptions, small fractures in the timeline that need to be fixed." Ethan's mind spun. Guardians? A faction of time travelers dedicated to preserving history? It seemed like something out of a science fiction novel. And yet, here the man sat, his words weaving a story far more complex and dangerous than Ethan could have imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan finally managed to ask. "What do you want from me?" The man paused, his gaze steady, like he was weighing Ethan's every word. "We've been watching you, Ethan. You're more connected to this than you realize. You've been searching for the truth, and now it's time you understand your role in all of this." Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. What did he mean by that? How was he connected? "The timeline isn't as linear as you think," the man continued. "It's full of potential diverging paths, some of them leading to disaster. The time travelers you've encountered, the ones you've seen in the sky, they're not just here to observe. Some of them are us, others are from different factions. Some believe history should be altered to fit a more favorable future. Others, like us, will go to great lengths to ensure nothing changes. The delicate balance we maintain isn't something that can be toyed with." Ethan's head swirled with questions. He had thought he understood the stakes, but this was more than he had ever anticipated. The fate of history, of Earth itself, seemed to rest in the hands of these travelers, these guardians, and somehow he was now a part of it. "So, what now?" Ethan asked, voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze hardened. "Now, you help us keep the timeline intact. You've already seen glimpses of what happens when things go wrong. You won't be alone in this, Ethan. But you must choose, will you stand with us, or will you let the timeline fall apart?" Ethan's world was rapidly unraveling as he delved deeper into the murky waters of time travel. The more he uncovered, the less he understood. What had seemed like a clear-cut mission to preserve history now appeared to be a battlefield, a hidden war that spanned centuries, one that had been fought in the shadows of time itself. There were no heroes and villains, no clear sides to take. The lines between right and wrong were, it seemed, entirely subjective in this strange, timeless conflict. The temporal guardians, the faction he had once believed were the sole protectors of the timeline, were only one piece of the puzzle. As he spent more time with them, he learned of others, other factions of time travelers, each with their own agendas. Some were committed to safeguarding history at all costs, while others sought to reshape it to their advantage, believing they could create a better future by altering the past. These factions had their own codes, their own philosophies, and they clashed over the very fabric of reality. Ethan had been swept into this web of ideological warfare, unsure of where to place his allegiance. The Guardians had spoken of preserving the natural flow of events, ensuring history unfolded as it was meant to. But the more he saw, the more he began to wonder, was history truly set in stone? Were these Guardians right to enforce their vision, or were they merely another form of control, an authoritarian force, hiding behind the guise of protection? And then, there were the other factions, the ones who believed that humanity could and should be guided, that history was not sacred but malleable, capable of being sculpted to avoid the suffering that plagued humankind. To them, the idea of preserving a flawed past was absurd. They argued that if they could change just one pivotal event, they could spare humanity from its darkest moments, from the wars, the injustices, the despair. As Ethan learned more, it became impossible to ignore the ethical struggles at play. Each faction had valid reasons for their actions, each rooted in a deep-seated desire to protect or improve humanity. But at what cost? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that these time travelers, these seemingly omnipotent beings, were not gods, but humans, flawed, like him. They were fighting a war that none of them truly understood, let alone had the moral high ground to claim. The pressure was mounting. As the conflict between factions grew, Ethan felt himself pulled in different directions. The fate of history of Earth, of humanity, was not something any one person or any one group should hold in their hands. But was it even possible to stop what had already begun? Would the timeline, once disturbed, ever be the same? The deeper Ethan dove into this hidden war, the more he realized that the question wasn't about who was right or wrong. The true question was, who would win, and what kind of world would be left behind? The first signs of instability were subtle at first. Ethan had spent weeks buried in his research, piecing together fragments of the time-traveling conflict, when he began to notice shifts in his own perception of reality. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes people he thought he'd seen before, reappearing in places they shouldn't have been, or conversations that felt out of place, as if they had been lifted from an earlier time. These anomalies were fleeting, but the sensation that time was slipping through his fingers grew stronger each day. The UFO sightings, once scattered and rare, became more frequent. They appeared in the same places, at the same times, as if they were trying to communicate something, or perhaps to observe the unraveling of history. Ethan watched as more and more people reported strange lights in the sky, some of them lasting longer than before, pulsing with an eerie intensity that suggested something was happening just beyond the veil of the present. These weren't just flashes of metal streaking through the atmosphere, they felt like warnings, as if something was about to break. Ethan's dreams began to change, too. The lines between what was real and what was imagined blurred. He saw flashes of alternate versions of his own life choices he hadn't made, paths he hadn't taken. He caught glimpses of a future that wasn't his, of a world where time itself was breaking down and humanity was left scrambling to pick up the pieces. It was as if the boundaries of time were eroding before his very eyes, slipping into strange, impossible tangents that made no sense. It wasn't just in his dreams either. Events around him seemed to warp. One day, he found himself walking down a familiar street, only to notice that the architecture was wrong. Buildings that had been demolished years ago stood in their place. The world around him was shifting, bending, as if it were caught in a tug-of-war between past and future. He questioned his own memories, wondering if he had been misremembering all along, or if the timeline was simply fraying at the edges, unraveling in real time. His encounters with the time travelers had become more tense. They were no longer offering answers but warnings. The Guardians, once confident in their mission to protect the timeline, now seemed unsure. Their voices held an edge of fear, a realization that their role in this mess might be far from what they had initially believed. Ethan could sense it. Time itself was becoming unstable, and they were all on the brink of something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. The temporal phenomena, the flickers of reality bending and shifting, were becoming more pronounced. Days seemed to stretch longer, as if time itself was dragging, fighting against its own passage. Strange, inexplicable occurrences plagued the city's people, lost in moments of déjà vu, others unable to recall what day it was. As if the fabric of time itself was beginning to tear, Ethan had a gut feeling that the world was about to change in ways that no one could predict. The patterns of time, once steady, were fracturing. Something monumental was coming, something far beyond the power of any faction, any group of time travelers to control. The sands of time were shifting, and no one, not even Ethan, knew where they would land. Ethan sat in the dim light of his study, the weight of the evidence surrounding him pressing down harder than ever. The books, the notes, the endless calculations, all of it, now felt like a jigsaw puzzle, with a missing piece he could no longer locate. Something was wrong. It was as if the air itself was thick with a strange tension, a repetition that gnawed at him. And then, the realization hit him, like a sudden electric shock that left him breathless. He was trapped, caught in a loop. The signs had been there all along, those fleeting moments of déjà vu, the conversations that echoed like old recordings, the world that seemed to flicker between timelines. Now, in the quiet solitude of his thoughts, everything came into sharp focus. He had been here before. Not physically, but mentally. Each moment, each decision, was repeating. The patterns were undeniable. The clues he had once followed so diligently, he now recognized them as markers, breadcrumbs in a trail that led nowhere. The UFO sightings, the strange temporal anomalies, the cryptic messages from the time travelers, all of them had circled back to this point, this unshakable sense of inevitability. Ethan wasn't just studying time anymore. He was part of it. Part of a grand, cyclical design that trapped him within its reach. The events that had shaped his journey were not simply the result of choices made by others or by chance. No, they were set in motion long ago, the result of a loop he couldn't escape. A pattern woven into the very fabric of his existence. In his most desperate moments, Ethan had suspected it, suspected that his own actions, his search for answers, were somehow bound to the same endless rhythm. But the truth, now undeniable, was even worse than he imagined. He was stuck in a loop, reliving moments over and over, unaware that each action led only to another repeat, another cycle of discovery. The question that burned in his mind was this: if he was the one caught in the loop, who had set it in motion, who had designed this cycle, this cosmic trap that played out across the eons, pulling him in and out of different versions of the same events? Was it the time travelers themselves? Or had the loop always existed, an inevitable consequence of tampering with time? The urgency of the moment clawed at him. He had to find a way out. He had to break free from this endless repetition before it consumed him completely. If he failed, if he couldn't find a way to alter the course of events, he would be doomed to live through the same events, again and again, watching the world spiral toward an inevitable fate. Ethan gathered his strength, focusing all his energy on the one thing that might allow him to escape: the ability to break the loop. There had to be a way. He couldn't be the one to repeat history endlessly. The key, the one thing that could change everything, lay just beyond his reach. He had to reach for it before time itself closed its doors for good. Ethan's heart raced as the weight of the revelation settled over him. The loop was no longer just a theory, it was a prison. And the key to breaking free was slipping further away with every passing moment. His mind, once sharp with the thrill of discovery, now felt clouded, as if time itself were conspiring to muddle his thoughts. There was no more room for questions or speculation, only action. The temporal disaster was imminent, and he could feel it in his bones. A future catastrophe, an event that threatened to collapse the very structure of history, was hurtling toward him. A singular moment that, if allowed to unfold, would ripple through time with consequences too vast to comprehend. Ethan knew that if this event wasn't stopped, everything humanity, the time travelers, the fabric of existence, would be lost to the void of an altered past. There was no time to waste. The clock was ticking, and the window to intervene was closing rapidly. He could almost hear the seconds slipping away, as if time itself were mocking him, daring him to act. He had to stop it. But he wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The strange alliances he had forged over the past weeks were now his lifeline. The human time travelers, those who had been sent from various points in the future to observe, protect, and sometimes correct the flow of time, were his allies in this race against the clock. But there were others, 2 alien time travelers, beings from distant worlds and timelines, who had their own stakes in the outcome. They had their own reasons for wanting to prevent the catastrophe, and they were just as determined as he was to alter its course. Together, they formed an unlikely coalition, a group united by the singular goal of averting the disaster that loomed ahead. They didn't trust each other entirely. There were tensions, differences in their approaches, even clashing philosophies. But there was no time for politics or personal agendas. The stakes were too high. History, as they knew it, hung in the balance, and if they didn't act now, they would all be doomed to witness its unraveling. The plan was simple, in theory. Ethan, along with his allies, would infiltrate the event, an intricate moment of temporal instability, and prevent it from occurring. The only problem was that they had no idea what form it would take. Time, they had learned, was rarely linear or predictable. The disaster could take any shape, any form, and it could strike at any moment. Ethan glanced at his team, their faces grim with determination. He could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on them. They had no choice but to succeed. If they failed, there would be no future to save, only a fractured, disjointed past that they would never truly understand. The race against time had begun, and there was no turning back. Ethan stood at the center of the fractured reality, surrounded by the hum of temporal distortions, the walls of time itself bending and cracking as the truth finally revealed itself. The figures before him, cloaked in shimmering light, were not what they seemed. They weren't alien visitors, nor were they anomalies from distant stars. They were something far more unsettling. Humans from the future. Beings sent across time to shape, protect, and sometimes control the very fate of Earth. For years, Ethan had hunted for answers, piecing together fragments of history, strange encounters, and cryptic messages from those who had claimed to know the truth. But the truth, like time itself, was never simple. Now, standing face to face with the future, he realized the enormity of what was at stake. These travelers weren't just observers. They were the custodians of time, and their mission was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The leader of the group, a figure whose face seemed to shimmer and shift with the flow of time, stepped forward. "You've uncovered much, Ethan," they said, their voice a mix of familiarity and distance, like an echo from a faraway place. "But you've only glimpsed the surface. The truth goes deeper than you can imagine." Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from us? From Earth?" The leader's eyes flickered, as if measuring the weight of his question. "We protect the timeline. We are the architects of human history, but we are not its creators. We were once like you, living in a future where chaos threatened to erase everything we knew. Time became unstable, and we were sent back to ensure the survival of your world. Without us, humanity as you know it would have never existed." The revelation hit him with the force of a thunderclap. So, the UFOs, the anomalies, the interventions, they've all been part of this plan? Yes, the leader replied, their voice now tinged with sorrow. But it's not just protection, it's control. We've intervened in pivotal moments to ensure the course of history moves in the right direction. We've saved civilizations from destruction. We've prevented wars, pandemics, and other cataclysmic events. But the cost of that intervention is steep, Ethan. You've seen the effects, the paradoxes, the loops. Time is a delicate thing, and the more we alter, the more we risk losing. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Are you saying that we're nothing but pawns in this game? That our lives, our choices don't matter? The leader shook their head, their gaze softening. No, you matter, but the bigger picture is beyond what you can understand. We didn't choose to become the guardians of time. We were forced into it. But now, the choice is yours. The future of Earth depends on you understanding our role and whether you will accept the responsibility that comes with it. Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. The truth had been unveiled, but the weight of it was almost unbearable. The fate of humanity, the stability of time itself, rested in his hands. The future was not written in stone. It was a fragile, shifting thing, dependent on those brave enough to stand at the crossroads and choose the path forward. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the world around him began to fracture. Time was no longer the steady, predictable force it once seemed. The fabric of reality trembled, warping and folding in on itself. His discoveries had set something in motion, something far larger than he had ever imagined. The truth about time travel, about the humans from the future, had begun to unravel the very essence of time itself. He stood in the heart of the storm, the air thick with the crackling tension of the moment. The once familiar world he knew was now a blur, distorted by the unseen forces of time bending and breaking. It felt as if the world had been a carefully constructed puzzle, and with his actions, the pieces were falling apart. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he watched the lines of history flicker like faulty film, events shifting, erasing, and reappearing in chaotic loops. Is this what happens when you meddle with time? Ethan whispered to himself. His mind was clouded with doubt and fear. The guardians of time, the beings who had once seemed like saviors, were now starting to look like the architects of something far more sinister. They had altered history to prevent disaster, yes, but at what cost? Could this unraveling be their fault, or had it always been inevitable? The closer Ethan got to the truth, the more he began to question the morality of it all. He turned to the shimmering figure standing beside him, the leader of the time travelers who had shown him so much. Is this the end? He asked, voice trembling. Is this how it all ends, time, collapsing in on itself? The leader's eyes were distant, their form shifting in the unsettling flow of time. No. This is the moment of choice. You have the power to stop it, to set things back on course. Or you can let time take its natural course. But that, too, will have consequences. Ethan's mind reeled, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He had always believed in the idea of fate, of destiny, guiding people down a set path. But now he realized that his every action, his very decision in this moment, would dictate the future of humanity and the very concept of time. Was it worth the risk to fix history, knowing that doing so could have unforeseen consequences? Or was it better to let the timeline unfold as it was meant to, accepting the chaos that might come with it? The wind howled around him as time continued to break and shift. His heart raced. He could feel the end coming, the end of time as he knew it. And in that fragile moment, Ethan understood that no decision would be simple. There would be no clear answer, only the weight of an unknown future. He closed his eyes, bracing for the choice that would come next. Ethan stood at the crossroads of destiny, the weight of the universe pressing down on him. The air around him crackled with anticipation, as though even the cosmos itself held its breath, waiting for his decision. He had come so far, unraveled so many mysteries, and now, in this singular moment, he was faced with the most profound choice of his life. Before him stood the figures beings from a future that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They were the time travelers, the architects of history, or perhaps the stewards of a history yet to be written. They were offering him a place among them, to continue the cycle, to join them in their never-ending task of shaping time. In exchange, he would gain a power beyond comprehension, the ability to influence the very course of history, to see through the veil of time itself. But the other option, the one that had been whispered in his ear by an unseen voice, was equally tempting. He could choose to stop it all, to sever the ties that bound humanity to this relentless loop, to halt the ever-branching timeline, and put an end to the manipulation of history. Time, as it had been known, would return to its natural state, no longer subject to the whims of travelers from the future. But that too came with a price. Stopping time travel would likely unravel the very foundation of human progress, sending ripples through the fabric of reality that could lead to irreversible consequences. Ethan's mind raced as he thought about the implications. On the one hand, joining the time travelers meant that the cycle would continue an eternal dance of shaping and reshaping the past, present, and future. He would have the power to prevent atrocities, to guide humanity toward greatness, and to witness history from a perspective few could even dream of. But the temptation to control, to decide what was right for humanity, left him with an uncomfortable feeling. Was it truly his place to dictate the future, to alter the course of history as he saw fit? On the other hand, stopping the time travel meant relinquishing that power, letting go of the control he had grown so accustomed to. It meant trusting humanity to follow its own path, with all the uncertainty and chaos that came with it. But there was something deeply freeing about that, something raw and beautiful in the thought of letting life unfold as it was meant to, untainted by the interference of future generations. Ethan looked around, seeing the flicker of time itself, bending and shifting. Every possibility stretched out before him like an infinite road, each with its own set of consequences. He knew this decision was not just about him, it was about the future of humanity, the future of everything. His hands trembled, and for the first time in his journey, he realized that the true weight of choice had never been so heavy. The cosmic decision loomed, and with it came the realization that no matter what path he chose, there would be no going back. Ethan stood alone beneath the vast, indifferent sky, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a distant storm, swirling and ready to break. He had made his choice, or perhaps, in the end, the choice had made him. The complexities of time, of fate, and of human existence had all led him here, to this singular moment in history, where every possibility branched outward like an endless horizon. The echoes of the time travelers still lingered in his mind, their words, their promises, and their warnings. They had offered him everything: power, knowledge, and control. A chance to alter the very course of history. But something within him knew that the true beauty of life lay in its uncertainty, its fragility. Time was not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be lived, with all its twists and turns, its successes and failures, humanity's mistakes, its triumphs, its struggles. These were the things that gave meaning to existence. He let out a slow breath, the weight lifting just a little as he accepted that his role in the grand scheme of things was not to change the future, but to embrace the present. The vast cosmic dance of time, of history, of being, it was beyond any one person's understanding, and yet, here he was, a part of it, woven into the fabric of the universe in ways he could never truly comprehend. He realized, with a kind of bittersweet peace, that this was enough. The world around him seemed to blur as the stars twinkled above, their distant light a reminder that all of this time, history, the very act of living was temporary. He didn't need to control it. He didn't need to solve it. He just needed to experience it. His mind quieted, the swirling thoughts of time and space settling into something softer. It was time to let go, to rest, to trust that the universe would unfold as it always had, endlessly, unpredictably, and beautifully. His body felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of a life fully lived, a journey that had led him to a deep and peaceful understanding. As his eyelids fluttered shut, the quiet hum of the universe sang a lullaby of peace. The mysteries of time, humanity's place in the cosmos, all felt distant and distant no more. He was no longer burdened by the need to know, to understand. In that moment, he was at peace with the unknowable. And as the world faded into the embrace of sleep, he smiled at the beauty of it all, at the wonder, at the simple, profound truth that sometimes the answers we seek are never as important as the questions we ask. And so, he let go, drifting into the final sleep, a quiet surrender to the mysteries of the universe that would remain forever unknown, yet always felt.